Good evening and welcome to the final edition of the St. Sebastian's Faculty Zoom Seminar Series, Aquinas on Morality and Happiness. Tonight, we will be hosted by Dr. Ryan Patrico from our Religion Department. My name is Mike Melly, and I am the Director of Alumni Programs at St. Sebastian's. In the first three seminars, we heard from some of our longest-serving faculty in Mr. Cleary, Mr. Lynch, and Mr. Wilbur. While Dr. Patrico is one of our newer teachers, he is a great example of the depth of talent we have in every department. Throughout this series, we have truly seen what it means when we say a St. Sebastian's man is a lifelong learner. Alumni from all generations, parents and grandparents have embraced this culture, and hundreds of you have registered for these lectures. In speaking with his former students about attending Dr. Patrico's class, James Esperna of the class of 2019 said it best. Dr. Patrico is a man who's not afraid to speak the truth. His love of theology and philosophy is surpassed only by the passion with which he teaches the Catechism of the Church. It is feedback like that which tells us how lucky we are to have such passionate teachers in our community. For anyone who has not used Zoom yet, I would encourage you to look in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and click on the button that says Speaker View. Now you should only be seeing me, but shortly you will see Ryan. Throughout the presentation, some slides will be shared and the prepared remarks will be followed by a Q&A session. Feel free to contact me in the chat session during the presentation, and I will call on you when the time comes. Now a few words about our host. Dr. Patrico grew up in Plattsburgh, Missouri, a small town north of Kansas City. He earned his undergraduate degree at Brown University, where he studied medieval history. Following college, Ryan moved to New York City, where he served as a junior fellow and assistant director at the cultural journal First Things. He then began a doctoral program in history at Yale. Ryan's dissertation explored the response of Catholic nuns to the Lutheran Reformation in Germany. He graduated with his PhD in 2017, and he has been at St. Sebastian's ever since. He teaches scripture and ethics and coaches 8th grade soccer and baseball. Ryan lives in Walpole with his wife and 3 young daughters. Without further ado, I present to you Dr. Ryan Patrico, Aquinas on Morality and Happiness.
Hello, wonderful, thank you. Welcome to my laundry room. This is like the first time in 3 months I've put on a button-down shirt. So if by the time this is all over, all the stress eating and all that, I'm gonna be lucky if my tie still fits. It's a real honor to be here. Dennis Cleary, Chris Lynch, Dave Wilbur, they don't get better than that. I'm going to be talking about happiness and friendship tonight. And a component of friendship is just having a role model in the other and growing in their from their own virtue. So I'm definitely surrounded by teachers who call me to be greater at St. Sebastian's. So when I was asked to talk tonight, I thought I would find a topic that everybody's interested in. And everyone is interested in happiness. Believe it or not, and it's not simply a passing interest for all of us. It's perhaps the most central, or is the central question of our lives. What is happiness and how do we achieve it? In fact, Aquinas argues that everyone wants to be happy, and that if we didn't want to be happy, we wouldn't be human, right? So the desire for happiness is a human desire. And the more we want to be happy, the more we want to be human. And so that's what I'm talking about today. You can kind of get a sense of that if you ask like a high school student. If I ask one of my students, why do you want to go to college? And they'll say, you know, because I want to get a good job when I grow up. Okay, well, why do you want a job? Well, you know, I need to be able to support myself and my family. And then they'll say, well, and then I'll say, well, why do you want to support yourself and have a family? Eventually, doesn't matter how long the questions go, eventually you're going to get to a confused student who says, well, I just want a good life. I want to be happy, right? And then that's where the question that's where the answers stop, right? It's the end, so to speak. The ultimate end of our lives is, in a sense, the search for happiness. Whether we, all those different things, the job, the career, family, are often, they're goods. They're goods that we can, they're goods in themselves, but they're also goods that are used to achieve a higher end. And we'll talk about that in tonight. So I want to start off real broadly with, I'm going to share a little slideshow with you. And if you want, please click on that speaker view so that you can see me as well. So the first question I want to try to ask is, what is happiness? And contrary to what is a common assumption today, happiness is not purely a subjective feeling or an emotional state. And we know this is the case because we are often happy doing things that don't feel good, right? If you think about a mother in childbirth, or a firefighter running into a building, or a soldier going off into battle, they're in a sense, they're happy to do it, even though they're terrified, or even though they're not. It's not a good feeling, but you wouldn't know that it's not a subjective emotional state based on what they teach at Yale. One of the most popular course in Yale's history is this happiness seminar. I don't know if you've seen it in the news, but it's run by this Professor Santos, and it's basically a whole series of life hacks about how you can kind of make yourself feel good. And I was watching this debate once with this professor who apparently believes that happiness is a subjective state. She was approached by this Catholic philosopher, and the philosopher said, happiness is really not just about a feeling. It's about acting. It's about doing something. It's about living well. What if I were to create this kind of like pleasure box that you could get into, and you wouldn't even know you were in it? But when you were in it, like, it would be just pure ecstasy, pure joy, would you get in it? And most of the students in the audience said no. Like, they knew instinctively, like, no, I wouldn't get in there because there's something wrong about that. You can't just trick yourself into being happy. But the professor said, of course I would get in there. And it kind of gets you to see that, like, in the modern world, we think that it's an emotional state. But in the classical world, happiness is really about living well. It's about, it's an art. It's an art form. The key to a good life is living well. And every living thing can be happy, according to Aquinas. Believe it or not, like, what does it look like for an oak tree to be happy? Well, oak trees don't have feelings, but they can reach their potential, which is what the classical view of happiness is. They can reach their potential given if they're given the opportunity to grow and given everything that they need to fulfill their nature. In the same way, a cow, you see a picture there of a cow. A happy cow is a cow that is living a cow life to the fullest. So it is eating and just enjoying a cow life to the fullest. So for human happiness, it in the classical sense, it means, what does it mean to be fully human? What do we need to do in order to reach our full potential? the other thing I want to point out about happiness is often overlooked is that happiness is a common good. And we often forget this. What that means is there are three components to anything being a common good. First of all, happiness is common to all of us in the sense that we all want to be happy, as I've already said. And second of all, happiness it's not competitive. Okay. So my happiness cannot and should not detract from your happiness, or in other words, my ability to be fully myself as a human being should not and cannot prevent you from being fully human. It's not some Hobbesian like war of all against all, right? And I think the reason we often think that happiness is a finite good is because we equate the things that we use to gain happiness as happiness. So like wealth is a finite good, or pleasure, I guess, is a finite good. You can only have so much of it. So I'm taking away from you if it's a zero-sum game in that sense. But the third point about happiness as a common good, and it's probably the most important for tonight, is that it's participatory. So what that means is that I grow in happiness when my happiness is shared with others. And in fact, I can only be truly happy. I can only truly reach my end or achieve my goal with others. So in class, I often use the example of a sports team has to work together in order to achieve its goal to win. Or think of like an orchestra, for example. Like all the individual instruments, when they play together, sound better than the sum of their parts, right? And if a cello player were to say, you know what, I'm going to go and take my cello and go home and play at home, he's not going to sound as good as he would together. So happiness is something that we can only achieve as a common good. Okay. Now, with that in place, I want to talk about what morality is. So if the goal of our lives is to be fully human, and to be fully human is to be happy, to kind of have a kind of reach our full potential, then morality is simply the art of achieving our goal. Or you could say morality is the way in which we become happy, or become happier, or proceed along that path to happiness. And again, because we forget that happiness is a common good, we think that morality must therefore be some kind of it's like a set of rules and regulations so as I don't get into anybody else's pursuit of happiness, right? It's like a set of obligations or regulations or responsibilities so that I don't infringe on anybody else's freedoms. But again, if happiness is a common good, then it's properly understood as participatory, and that understanding of morality doesn't work. That understanding of morality, the modern understanding of morality, is a limiting sense of freedom, in which you're free from achieving. Well, you're free from obligation or responsibility. The classical view of freedom and morality is a freedom for excellence, freedom for achieving your potential. And so in that sense, anything that is good is something that makes you more human. Good actions bring us closer to our goal of happiness, and bad actions lead us away from that goal of being human. And in fact, the classical word for sin is hamartia. It means to miss the mark. So morality is more like a way of life that leads you to your fullest potential, which is ultimately the only thing that will satisfy you. Okay. So again, when we act rightly, when we act in accord with our nature, we're doing something that is more human, more real. Okay, it's getting us closer to happiness, and anything that's bad, so to speak, is simply a negation of or an absence of something that would lead us to happiness. It's not leading us closer to that goal. And so for this reason, in the classical view, virtue is so important. Virtues are those habits and traits which make it easier for us to do the right thing, right? So in my class, we talk about the cardinal virtues, and those are like the hinge virtues, the like most important virtues that help us do the right thing even when it's hard, right? So a soldier knows what it is to be fully a soldier, and as such can achieve it, can fulfill his nature in a sense by practicing virtue. And vice is are the habits and dispositions which make it harder for us to do the right thing. It's really that clear. It's really that straightforward. Okay, so I've said that happiness is achieving our true potential as humans. I've said that morality is simply the way of that leads us to that fulfillment. But I haven't answered that central question: what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be man? If this is true, if this vision of happiness is true, we can only be happy when we achieve our own nature. We have to know what that nature is. Okay. So so going back to Plato and Aristotle, and it's a clear line straight from Augustine to Aquinas tonight. It's clear just by use of reason alone that man is a rational, social, interdependent creature. I mean, Aristotle said he's a political animal, political in the sense of like the polis, the city, and he's a rational creature. Okay, so if we're going to achieve our full potential, it would imply that we need to be kind of fully rational and kind of fully relational, fully social. And that is indeed what the classical view is. Man is fully himself when he reasons, he knows, and he acts on that knowledge. And so to know the good and to act on it is kind of shorthand for to love, right? The rational soul is comprised of the intellect and the will, and you use those two faculties in order to love, which is simply willing the good of the other for the other's sake. That we can't be human, truly human, unless we use all of our capacities, and that coincidentally is the one capacity that we have unto ourselves, right? That we alone among the created universe have this rational capacity to know and to love. Okay, so if we are truly relational, then it seems that To be human is to be tied together. And so the classical view from Aristotle on is that part of a good life, part of a life well lived, is to be a friend and to have friends, and that we can't really be human without friendship. And why is that? It's because, again, we are social animals, and that we come into this world it's a given that we come into this world as part of a long, complicated network of relationships. And there's no way around that. And the more you pretend that it's otherwise, the more unhappy you're going to be, right? The more you try to live for yourself and not for others, the less happy you'll be. I mean, it's just a fact. But I want to get back to Aristotle. He says that the reason that friendship is so important is that a friend is a second self, another self, okay? And that implies that we only find ourselves when we will the good of the other, which is what friendship is. And what happens when you will the good of the other is that other person becomes another you, right? And all of a sudden, you grow. Your being expands, and your happiness suddenly encompasses the happiness of those around you. Think about the happiness of a family. There is no way that the individuals in a family can pursue their own so-called happiness as individuals without reference to the group, right? If I have a kid at home who's sick, I can't go and have a long run, or I can't go out to a bar and leave my kids at home thinking that, like, well, I need to go get mine. Like, happiness is simply your happiness suddenly with friendship becomes dependent on another. And another thing about friendship is that, as I alluded to at the beginning, the friend calls you to greater friendship through his own virtue. So our friends, I know my wife is more virtuous than I am. She calls me to greater friendship, right? And so in communion with others, I become more of who I am meant to be, which is to say, I become more happy. Now, Aristotle theorized here that the best possible scenario for friendship, if friendship is something that calls you to a greater good and brings you into a bigger sense of self, right, or brings you into a higher state of being, he suggested and implied that the greatest friendship we could ever have would therefore be God, right, because he is the greatest good, right, and he could, in virtue of being God, call us to the greatest virtue. So Aristotle is kind of theorizing about what it would mean to be fully, truly happy, and he would say, well, it would be friendship with God. But then Aristotle says to himself, well, that's all well and good, but it's not possible, because God is too unlike us. He's not like, friends have to have something in common, right? Something in common that they can share together in order to be friends. And humans and God are too different. The divine nature and the human nature, there's no way that those can be reconciled in order to be truly friends. So as much as it would be good to be friends with God, it's according to Aristotle, it's not possible. And this is where Christian revelation really comes in. This isn't simply Thomas Aquinas. This is the whole tradition. Says that the whole point of Christian revelation is that what Aristotle assumed to be impossible ended up being precisely the truth. Okay, this is if you see on your slide there, this is John chapter 15. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. That's the summation of what I'm trying to say tonight. That happiness is being complete, being fully yourself, and that you can only be fully yourself with friends. And that a friend is someone who shares his life with you, and that life becomes greater because of that sharing, right? It's better than the sum of the parts. And that's what Christ reveals to us in the incarnation, that God wants to be our friend, that he is our friend, and because of that, it's possible for us to be truly happy. Christian revelation makes this clear. Not only is it does the Scripture tell us that that we are more like God than we could have known, right, on our own, right? What does it say? It says that we are made in his image and likeness, which is to say we share something in common with him, which means it's possible for us to be friends with him. And what is it that we share with him? What does it mean to be made in his image? It means that we can love. It means that we can be friends with one another. And in fact, that is the very nature of the Trinity. If you really want to get down to it, it's one God in three persons, right? The Father loves the Son, and the Son loves the Father, and out of that, a greater relationship is created with the Holy Spirit. So, happiness is love, and God is love, and we can be friends with God, right? Which means that we can be happy. Now, there's one other thing that Aquinas points out, it's that this path to happiness, paradoxically, goes through the cross. He says that the cross exemplifies every virtue. So Aquinas says that on the cross, Jesus is stripped of all the things that we often confuse for happiness. He says Christ has no power, he has no wealth, he has no fame, he has no pleasure on the cross. And yet, in a very paradoxical way, right, he is happy. And why is he happy? It's because he's loving to the fullest. He's doing that thing for which he was made, and not just made as a human, as God, right? God is love, but he's not only revealing what it means to be truly God, he's revealing what it means to be truly human, right? He says that there is no greater love than this, to lay down one's life for a friend. Okay, so he's reconciling on the cross humanity and divinity. He's revealing to us that we are friends, and he's showing us in a very difficult way what it means to be happy. Okay, so I'll finish I began with this anecdote from Yale, and I'll finish with one from Harvard. I don't know if you've seen this in the news, but there's this longitudinal study that's been going on at Harvard for over 75 years. And since 1938, Harvard has been tracking the lives of a group of men in and around Boston. And, over the course of 80 years, it's been, had different focuses and different conclusions, and it's been used to track happiness, or it's been used to track health and social status and wealth and all those kinds of things. But the study's slowly winding down because the cohort is dying out. And after 80 years, they're finally drawing some conclusions. And basically what they've decided, or what they've seen, is that the men in the study who report the higher overall life satisfaction, the greatest amount of happiness, so to speak, that happiness was not at all tied to how they did on the stock market, or how healthy they were. The overall indicator of their happiness was the strength of their relationships. In other words, how well they were able to love, how well they were able to be friends with one another, with their spouses, with their children, with their friends. And I just think it's so funny that, Harvard has been studying this for 80 years, and they've concluded that the key to happiness is love, right? And I can just imagine this, academia being like a huge hill that you climb up, the Mount Everest of knowledge, and you get to the top, and the big reveal is okay, the key to happiness, the key to life is love, right? And you can imagine this social scientist climbing finally got there. And I was just imagining this big, portly Thomas Aquinas sitting there at the top when they got there, and he's like, "What took you so long?" So anyways, thank you very much.
Ryan, thank you. That was fantastic. I really appreciate that time. We do have questions lining up here, and I will enable all the participants to unmute themselves when they want, but I will call on you one at a time. The first question we have from the field, they would prefer to remain anonymous, and I'll read it to you. There seems to be various degrees of happiness. Are there also various degrees of reaching your potential?
So according to the classic view, no, there's an ultimate end for all of us, and it's something that we share in common. It's, according to Aquinas, it's not something we can achieve in this life, right? It's ultimately something that we can only really have fully in heaven, right? Because ultimate happiness would be, according to Aquinas, you'd have to be able to enjoy it indefinitely, right? Which is not something we can do at all here because we all die. So.
Okay, great. I am going to call on Thayer Wade right now to step into the ring. Thayer, are you there? See if I can unmute you for yourself there. Stay with me 1 second. Okay, Thayer, you seem to be ready to go. Sorry.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Patrico. This was absolutely fantastic.
Good.
Really, really enjoyed it. The whole idea of friendship as the path to happiness is something that's really always drawn me to Aristotle, and I've thought back to it, for in multiple times since I've studied it. My question is kind of not to take a modern understanding and to try to throw it on the classical sense, but if you look at, misunderstanding of happiness is just having a lot of, wealth, and you can buy whatever you want or whatever you need.
Yeah.
Well, if wealth is the path to happiness, then more wealth should get you more happiness. Does the same hold for friendship? Does having more friends get you more happiness? Obviously, I don't think so, because building friendship takes time, which is a limited resource for us in general. But then the question, I guess, becomes, what's the ideal number of friends? And thank you so much for this. This is really, really great.
Yeah. So I guess as far as wealth is concerned, like they've done studies and said that like actually, yeah, it plateaus, right? There's like a certain amount after which it's like diminishing returns. Like, $10,000 will help someone below the poverty line, and it'll help them a lot. But after a certain point, you're not as happy anymore. As friendship is a little different, because I think the way you phrased it, it was like more friends and you'd have more happiness. And you're right. Aristotle says, I think that true friendship is very rare, precisely because of what you said. Like it's a limit. You only have so much time on Earth. I think it would be quality over quantity, right? So your spouse or your siblings or your parents or whatever, you can kind of grow closer to them in a deeper way that kind of more closely intimates your, prepares you in a sense for that divine vision, because you're giving yourself away more to your spouse or to your parent or to your sibling.
That makes perfect sense. Not to take the other side of it, but then is only one friend ideal? A perfect friend that it's obviously so rare to find.
Well, no, I don't think it would be ideal. If you think of like heaven as the ideal, right? You still have communion in heaven with the saints, right? So it's not like you're just looking at God. It's like a participatory thing that you grow in with everyone. So, this life doesn't imitate. I mean, it like in a mirror darkly or whatever Paul says. Like we can kind of imitate it here, but it's going to be out of this world bonkers when we get there. So,
yeah. Makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, great there. Nice to see you again. I want to call on Anthony Perez. Anthony, if you want to unmute yourself and join the conversation. Sorry about the delay there, Anthony. I think you should be good to go now. I'm not sure why it's not allowing you to unmute yourself, but go right ahead.
Awesome. I think I'm unmuted now. Hi, Doctor.
Hi, Tony.
Thank you so much for doing this. I'm actually about to go into finals week, and just the topic of, how do you get happy? It seems like, something that could be very beneficial for someone in my position right now.
Exactly.
So my question was, really honing in on the idea of humans being a social species, and, needing friendship. While I don't necessarily hold this view, how would you respond to, I don't know, maybe the sort of contemporary attempt to attribute the role of of friendship and happiness to nature, some sort of evolutionary, effect, as opposed to evidence of some sort of, higher authority. So I guess basically, I'm asking you to respond to sort of like a moral naturalism sort of idea.
Right. I mean, I don't know. The guy who, I mean, there's no conflict between faith and reason. At some point, a couple of our great ancestors were imbued with the spark of the Holy Spirit, or given the kind of imprinted with the image of God. That doesn't in any way conflict with kind of naturalistic expectation that we're also herd animals, so to speak, and that we do better in packs. Yeah, I don't see a conflict there. If that's helpful.
Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anthony, thanks so much. Ryan, we're going to hear next from James Esperna, and I'm going to unmute you now, James.
Big Jim's here.
Go right ahead.
Hi.
James, are you with us?
I see him talking.
James, I think you're still muted. But
no, he's not muted. Is your input?
Okay. James, I'm going to put you on pause for a moment because I do have another question from the field that I can have somebody join in. Stay with me 1 second. I threw off my timing there. From the field, is friendship the same as companionship? How are the two differentiated?
I don't know that one. Companionship and friendship. I mean, I would think they're the same. I mean, what's the etymology of companion? Someone you break bread with, right? Compan, right? So that friendship is something that occurs when the bread is broken. I don't know. That would be my guess.
I guess it depends on who's cooking then, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. One more question from the field. Given that good actions lead to happiness, bad actions make us less human, why do we continuously make decisions and bad actions? Why does it happen to us all the time?
Chesterton said that original sin is the only doctrine of the church that can be verified with our eyes. Like it's demonstrable, right? So I said that when we're born into a series of relationships, right? And that kind of illustrates that we're social animals, but we're born into a series of relationships that are broken already, so there's already it's already difficult for us to love as we ought to love because the people that we're surrounded by are already broken. So they're limping and I'm limping coming into this world, and because of that we can't love as we ought, and that means we can't be happy as happy as we should be. And that's why somebody had to come and like break that cycle of brokenness. So somebody got inserted into this chain reaction of brokenness, and he happened to be perfect, God and man, and then the chain reaction was kind of severed forever, right? We can now find our happiness through that true friend.
Okay, great. I do think we've reconnected with James. James, do you want to step up? Can you unmute? I'll help you here. Hold on 1 second. Okay, go for it, James. Let's see. Ryan, you see him unmuted, don't you?
I see him unmuted, yes.
Yes, okay.
There you go.
There he is.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Great lecture, by the way.
Okay.
I love Aquinas, so this was perfect.
Good.
But yeah, no, I just had a little bit of a question about the historical context of all of this. So a lot of how Aquinas approaches reason is in, some might say, a sharp contrast to the writings of Augustine or Anselm or people like that. So what kind of obstacles did he have? What kind of intellectual obstacles did he have in writing his philosophy with regards to reason?
As in, like, was he more optimistic about our use of reason than Augustine, or what do you mean?
Well, no, I mean, I would, I mean, at least from my understanding, his views on reason were a little revolutionary for the time. So what kind of pushback did he receive from other thinkers, or yeah, stuff like that?
So you scratched me and I found a historian, not a theologian. There are theologians on this lecture here. I can see them. I mean, he is, in a sense, optimistic about our ability to reason our way to God, but he says, you know, of course, that you can only get so far. I mean, wasn't he was famous for incorporating Aristotle to the point that people were scandalized, right? And he loves him so much that he just says, like, the philosopher, like, that's it, boom, that's all you need. So that was his big contribution. Was Aquinas was saying, no, we, like, 300 years before Christ, this guy Aristotle had it almost figured out, right? Almost figured out, and then it's like Christian revelation comes in and puts it up into a higher register. It's the same thing, but boom, it's like 4-dimensional instead of 3-dimensional. So I think that was his big. I mean, he did everything. I mean, he's a giant among men. And I haven't read the Summa or anything. That's one of the, Flannery O'Connor, one of my favorite authors. She used to read the Summa every night before bed. And so when her first story came out, Good Man's Hard to Find, it was so brutal and dark that people were confusing it for something else. So one of the first reviews said that she was a hillbilly atheist. And she responded, she said, I'm a hillbilly Thomist, right? I don't read enough Aquinas to qualify as a Thomist, but I might get the hillbilly part, if, coming from Missouri. But,
thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, James, thanks so much for joining in. And I do think right now we are almost pretty much out of questions, but I wouldn't let it go. Actually, Joe Crissati just chimes in. Hold on, let me just.
No, my roommate over there. Right.
Joe, can you?
He's got an actual PhD in philosophy, so.
All right, here he is. Joe, step right up.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Great.
Okay, great. So my question, Dr. Patrico, is a question that I received from a student, I think, at one point, which is, can there be friendships, even though in this world there's kind of a divide between us and God, even though Christ is an intermediary for us. But can there be a kind of friendship that a person could have, perhaps in a convent? I know this is something that you know a lot about. So could you maybe describe friendship that you might find, among, those living.
Oh yeah.
A solitary
monastic
life?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess, Aquinas argued that, grace builds on nature, and that, grace is, above nature in that sense, that there's, the spiritual reality is higher, and, all the medievals and they would argue that, certain callings are actually more important than others, or actually have a higher dignity, in the chain of being or whatever. and that I would argue that the monastics like kind of got a head start. I mean, that's the whole point of monasticism, is like you're already imitating the divine friendship because you've died to yourself physically, right? So if marital love is like a physical intimation of like spiritual love, then if you can obtain spiritual love without the physical, you're kind of skipping a step, you know. So there that like that friendship that the monastics have with one another would in a sense be even more communal because it's more spiritual, you know. It's and because it's more spiritual, it's less finite, right? That would be my answer.
Hey, Ryan, we have more questions coming through. I'm going to call on Aaron Aluna to come out.
Oh.
Aaron, can you step right up?
Hi, Dr. Patrico. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I have kind of a dark question, I suppose. I'm interested maybe in the instances in which not necessarily bring night adventure. I know a lot of people who are,
Aaron, if you might want to start
doing the right
over
thing,
again.
and they're. Oh, I'm sorry.
You might want to start over again. You broke up there. You sound good now, but you might want to start over again.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. The instances in which virtue does not necessarily bring happiness. So when virtue brings suffering, when there's a kind of a dark night of the soul situation, can you speak a little bit about that? Like people who maybe do the right thing and then they're miserable?
Yeah. Well, that's often the case, isn't it, in a broken world, right? And that the most virtuous man ended up with a lot of suffering, right? He ended up on a cross. It's kind of the way of the virtuous man in a fallen world. So there's a kind of correlation between being virtuous and suffering. You know, but it is a kind of, by the way I defined it, if you're virtuous, you are going to be more happy, right? Because virtue is just simply the thing that helps you achieve your end, your fulfillment. So it would be like being virtuous and suffering for it is kind of like the stripping away of those external realities that we often confuse for happiness. That's not to say that happiness isn't also subjective, right? Or a thing that we experience. I don't want to take away from, because like, from what I've heard, childbirth is painful, right? Like, but it's also kind of subjectively pleasant in a weird way, like, because you're I see some smirks. It's like you're losing yourself, is what I'm trying to say, and you're living for another person. So that experience of transcendence is kind of a revelatory experience. So virtue can and will lead to suffering, Aaron. Yeah.
Hasn't so far for me. So.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, you're muted, Mike.
I'm muted. I'm losing track. Thank you, Aaron, so much. And I did see Bill Burke in the gallery. Bill, do you want to join us? I've unmuted you.
Sure. Ryan, I can't thank you enough. This is awesome. I love the way you began by just taking students down the path. You know, what are you in this for? Why do you want to go to college? And getting to the nub of it. And the phrase that they seem to like the most here, because it speaks to their soul, is that the essence of life is in relationships.
Yep.
And you helped all of us go deep with that in a great way tonight. So I can't thank you enough. And I love the notion, and I've thought of this a lot before, of Jesus perfecting Aristotle. Like, God, guy almost had it right.
Yeah.
He didn't have any revelation or anything, you know.
Right.
It makes you admire him all the more.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? So it was just a great night, intellectually rich and wonderful, and you're you're such a good lecturer, and you're so humble and so powerful, and we're really blessed to have you on this team. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Bill, thanks so much for joining us again. And I just want to, in the end here, thank everybody who has presented. I know they're not all here, but Mr. Cleary, Mr. Wilbur, Mr. Lynch, and obviously Dr. Patrico tonight. Just a great example of, what teachers can bring to the table and the impact they can have on young men. And Dr. Patrico, thank you for an enlightening and really spiritually enhancing evening. Thanks again to everybody for attending.
Thank you very much.
Mike.